The dining room at Maison Dorval smelled the way old money always does, like cedar, crushed flowers, and something faintly chemical that no amount of fresh linen could quite disguise. Tessa Bowen had worked the floor long enough to know the smell meant trouble. Not trouble in the obvious sense. No shattered glass, no allergic reaction, no kitchen fire. The trouble that came with this particular scent was quieter and far more exhausting. It was the trouble of men who believed the square footage of a room was theirs by right the moment they entered it. Men who summoned waitstaff with a single raised finger, without looking up from their conversation. Men who sent back wine, not because anything was wrong with it, but because the act of sending it back reminded everyone within earshot who was in charge. Tonight, the man in question was seated at table 7. His name was Rafferty Kane, and he had arrived 40 minutes late, which was itself a kind of performance. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the particular kind of fitness that comes not from discipline, but from having a personal trainer and enough disposable time to treat the gym like a second office. His suit was charcoal and almost certainly bespoke. His watch caught the candlelight each time he gestured, which was often because Rafferty Kane gestured when he spoke the way other men breathed, continuously and without apparent thought. He was, according to the reservation notes, the founder of a Vancouver-based private equity firm. He had booked the entire private dining room at Maison Dorval for 11 guests, all of them investors or prospective ones, and he had made the reservation under his assistant's name, which Tessa had learned was also something men like this did, a small insulation between themselves and the ordinary machinery of the world. She had clocked him the moment he walked in, not because he was loud, not yet, but because of the way the room rearranged itself around him. His guests had already been seated, nursing their pre-dinner cocktails, and when Rafferty entered through the glass-paneled door, the energy shifted in that subtle, almost imperceptible way that Tessa had come to recognize over 5 years of waiting tables in rooms exactly like this one. Spines straightened, smiles appeared. Someone laughed at something he hadn't said yet. She tucked the observation away and went about her work. Maison Dorval occupied the top floor of a heritage building on Saint-Jacques Street in Old Montréal, the kind of address that appeared in travel magazines with descriptions like understated elegance and a love letter to Québécois culinary tradition. The restaurant seated 42 in the main room and another 16 in the private dining salon, which was where Tessa was stationed tonight. The walls were lined with dark wainscoting and framed botanical prints. The ceiling was pressed tin, original to the building, painted the color of old cream. The cutlery was real silver and had to be polished by hand every Tuesday. Tessa had been working this room for 3 years. Before that, she had spent 2 years at a brasserie on Saint-Denis that paid better, but smelled of fryer oil, and before that, she had been a graduate student at McGill, 18 months into a master's program in computational linguistics with a thesis supervisor who had called her work genuinely promising in the careful, understated way that academics reserved for things they actually meant. She didn't think about that often. There was no practical use in it. What mattered now was table 7, and the fact that Rafferty Kane had just sent back the bread. Not the wine, the bread. He had lifted the small ceramic dish, examined the sourdough, with the expression of a man who had expected something else entirely, and held it out toward her without making eye contact. "Something with less crust," he said. "My dentist would appreciate it." Several of his guests laughed. One of the women, Tessa would later learn her name was Petra Kane, his wife, seated 2 chairs to his left, did not laugh. She looked at her water glass instead. Tessa took the bread back without a word and returned with a brioche roll, softer. which she set down with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Rafferty glanced at it, nodded once, and went back to his story. She had learned very early in this job that invisibility was a professional skill. The best servers were the ones guests could not quite remember afterward, which was not the same as being forgettable. It required a very specific kind of presence, close enough to respond, distant enough not to intrude. You listened to everything and acknowledged nothing. You moved through a room like weather. She was good at it, some nights frighteningly good. The evening moved through its courses with the careful rhythm of a well-conducted meal. Tessa poured and cleared and answered questions about the menu with the particular fluency that came from having memorized every supplier relationship and cooking technique the kitchen used. She knew, for instance, that the duck was sourced from a farm in the eastern townships, that the head chef had trained in Lyon before moving to Montreal in 2009, that the dessert cart featured a tarte tatin whose recipe had not changed in 11 years. She knew these things because she had made it her business to know them, the same way she had once made it her business to understand the syntactic structures of endangered languages, or the way her mother had once made it her business to keep meticulous records of every medical appointment, every prescription, every insurance claim, in the months after the diagnosis. She didn't think about that often either. It was somewhere between the fish course and the entrees when the piano came up. The private dining room at Maison d'Orval had, in its far corner, a small upright piano, a Heintzman, perhaps 100 years old, restored and kept in tune more as an aesthetic object than a functional one. It was rarely played. Occasionally, on special occasions, the restaurant arranged for a pianist for the evening. Tonight was not one of those nights. The piano sat where it always sat, its fallboard closed, a single white orchid in a bud vase placed on top of it. Rafferty Kane noticed it around the time the entrees arrived. "Does that thing actually work?" he asked, gesturing toward it with his wine glass. Tessa, refilling the water at the far end of the table, glanced up. "It does," she said. "We have it tuned every quarter." Rafferty seemed pleased by this information, in the way that men like him were pleased by information, not because it was interesting in itself, but because it confirmed the existence of a new arena. He turned to survey his guests. Anyone play? There was the usual murmur of deflection. One man said he'd had lessons as a child, but that was 30 years ago. A woman said she'd always meant to learn. Another man, younger, trying to make an impression, said he played a bit, casually, nothing serious. Rafferty's eyes moved around the table with an expression Tessa recognized, the particular boredom of a man who was very rarely surprised. "My daughter plays," said the older man at the end of the table. His name, Tessa had gathered from the seating card, was Aldous. No, wait. The card had read Mr. G. Whitfield, but the others called him something else. He was perhaps 70, with white hair gone thin at the crown, and the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned, over many decades, that stillness was its own form of power. He had barely spoken all evening. She competed nationally, won a few things. Rafferty smiled. "Well, she's not here tonight, is she?" The old man's expression did not change. Rafferty set down his glass and pushed back slightly in his chair, the way people do when they are about to make a production of something. What about the staff? He looked around, not at anyone in particular, the way people sometimes address a room as though the walls were listening. "Anyone on your team play?" The question was directed at no one, or it was directed at everyone, which was, Tessa understood, its own kind of direction. She was standing by the service credenza, her back half-turned, making a small note on her order pad about the allergy at seat 9. "I play a little," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She was not entirely sure why she had. Perhaps it was the particular quality of Rafferty's smile in the moment before she spoke, that easy, settled confidence of a man who expected the answer to be no. Every head at the table turned. Rafferty's smile widened. "A little," he repeated. "A little," Tessa confirmed. He gestured toward the piano with an open hand. The gesture was magnanimous and slightly theatrical, the way invitations are when they're not really invitations. "Be our guest." The room waited. Tessa looked at the piano. Then she looked at the order pad in her hand. Then she looked at the 11 people seated at table 7, all of them watching her with the mild, expectant attention of people who believed they were about to be briefly entertained, and then go back to their dinner. "I'm working," she said. "It's one song," Rafferty said. "We won't tell your boss." Polite laughter from the table. The kind of laughter that isn't really about what was said. Tessa set down her order pad on the credenza. What happened next was something she would think about for a long time afterward, in the specific way that she turned over moments that couldn't be fully explained. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more like the moment when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and someone stands in front of you with their arms crossed and tells you it doesn't look that heavy, and something simply releases. She crossed the room to the piano. She sat down on the bench, adjusted it slightly with the unconscious efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they needed, and lifted the fallboard. The keys were ivory and ebony, slightly warm from the room's ambient heat. She placed her hands on them and felt the particular stillness that she only ever felt in this exact position. The stillness that had been there since she was 8 years old and her mother had saved for 6 months to buy a second-hand Yamaha upright and install it in the corner of their apartment in Verdun. And the piano teacher who came on Thursday afternoons had told Tessa in her careful, measured English that she had a gift that should not be wasted. She hadn't thought about that in a long time either. She played Scarlatti, not the obvious choice, not something recognizable, something crowd-pleasing and tidy. She played the sonata in D minor, K141, which is a piece that sounds, at moderate tempo, like a charming Baroque exercise, pleasant and ornate, but played at proper tempo, the way Tessa had practiced it for 3 years in her early 20s, until her fingers could manage the hand-crossing passages without thought. It transforms into something else entirely, something vertiginous, a kind of controlled falling. She played it at proper tempo. The room went quiet in the way that rooms do when something unexpected has crossed into something undeniable. She could hear, distantly, the sound of her own breathing, and beneath that the faint percussion of her fingers on the keys, and beneath that nothing. The ambient sounds of a busy kitchen 1 floor below, the hum of climate control, the distant suggestion of street noise through the building's thick walls. All of it seemed to stop, or rather to recede, the way the world recedes when you are paying very close attention to something that deserves it. She finished. The silence lasted a full breath after the final note. Then someone at the table said quietly, "Good Lord!" It was the old man, Mr. Whitfield. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite pass, something between recognition and something more careful than that. Rafferty Kane had not moved. His wineglass was still in his hand, held exactly where it had been when she sat down. His expression was difficult to read. He was a man who had built an entire professional identity around being impossible to impress, and Tessa watched something move through him that she suspected he would not acknowledge later, even to himself. That was, he started. "Scarlatti," said Mr. Whitfield, before Rafferty could finish. His voice was unhurried. Kirkpatrick 141. She played the second half at something close to Horowitz's tempo. Rafferty looked at the old man. Then he looked back at Tessa, who was standing now, having closed the fallboard and stepped back from the bench. "You're a server," Rafferty said. It wasn't a question. It was the observation of a man recalibrating, which is different from a question, because a question implies uncertainty. Rafferty Kane did not deal in uncertainty. He dealt in positions, and when a position became untenable, he adopted a new one with the smooth, untroubled efficiency of a man who had had a lot of practice. "Tonight I am," Tessa said. She picked up her order pad from the credenza and looked at the table. "Can I get anyone another glass of the Burgundy? I believe we're down to the last 3 bottles of the 2018, and I'd recommend it before we move to the Bordeaux." The shift back to the business of the evening was so deliberate, so complete, that several guests seemed momentarily unsure what to do with it. 2 people said yes to the Burgundy. The conversation at the table resumed, slower at first, then with increasing animation, as though the room were gradually remembering what it had been doing before. Tessa poured the wine. She was back at the credenza, making a note in her order pad, when she felt rather than saw Mr. Whitfield approach. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about the weather, and he stopped a respectful distance away, as though asking permission to take up space. "Pardon me," he said quietly. Tessa looked up. "Where did you study?" he asked. It was not the question she had expected. Most people, in the moments after something like this, asked some version of "Why are you working here?" which was, she had always thought, a much less interesting question. "I studied with Hélène Descoteaux for 8 years," she said, privately. "And then I was accepted to the Glenn Gould School in Toronto." Mr. Whitfield was very still. "Was accepted," he said. "I deferred, and then deferred again." She paused, and then it was no longer an option. She didn't elaborate. There was nothing in his expression that required her to, which she appreciated. A lot of people, upon hearing partial explanations, pushed for the rest. Mr. Whitfield simply nodded, with the particular nod of someone who understood that some stories don't require their middle sections to be audible to be understood. "My name is Gerald Whitfield," he said. He extended his hand. "I sit on the board of the Montréal Conservatoire, and I chair the endowment committee." Tessa looked at his hand, then at his face. She shook his hand. "I know who you are," she said. "You gave the keynote at the 2019 fundraising gala." I read the transcript. Something moved through Gerald Whitfield's eyes that might, in different light, have been called delight. "You read the transcript of a fundraising keynote. I read a lot of things," Tessa said. "I had time." Behind them, at table 7, Rafferty Kane was now holding court again, a story, something about a property deal in Calgary, something with a punchline that made 2 of his guests laugh. He had recovered his equilibrium entirely, and Tessa suspected that by the time he reached his car tonight, the incident with the piano would have been edited, in his memory, into something that confirmed a story he already held about himself. Something about the hidden talents of the service industry, something generous and a little condescending. Gerald watched her watching Kane. "He's not a bad man," Gerald said. "He's simply never been surprised before. It's a particular kind of disadvantage." Tessa said nothing. "There is a position," Gerald continued, in the careful, specific way of someone who has decided to say something and is choosing each word deliberately. "At the Conservatoire. Not a performance position. Not yet. It's in our outreach program. Working with students in underserved communities. The salary is modest. The hours are irregular." He paused. "It requires someone with genuine musicianship, and I would say a somewhat unusual tolerance for operating in environments where people underestimate you." Tessa looked at him. "That is a very specific job description," she said. "I wrote it myself," Gerald said, "approximately 30 seconds ago." A brief silence. "I need to go check on the kitchen's timeline for dessert," Tessa said. "Of course," Gerald said. He returned to his seat. Tessa walked through the door to the service corridor, let it swing shut behind her, and stood in the fluorescent quiet for a moment. The corridor smelled of industrial cleaner and something from the kitchen. Butter. Something caramelizing. The faint sweetness of the tart tatin. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the low voices of the prep cooks, the rhythmic clatter of a sheet pan. She had stood in this corridor many times. She knew the particular sound of this kitchen's rhythms, the way you know the rhythms of a place you've spent years of your life inside. She knew that the dessert service would begin in approximately 14 minutes, that the tart tatin came out plated in individual portions now because the kitchen had changed their approach 2 years ago, that she needed to remind the sommelier about the sauternes pairing for the table by the window. She knew all of this the way she knew a lot of things, precisely, and at some cost. Her mother was doing better now. Not well, there was a difference, and Tessa was not someone who confused the two, but better. The medication had been adjusted in the spring. The fatigue had lessened. She had started going to her book club again on Tuesday evenings, which she had stopped going to for 2 years, and this fact, small as it was, had made Tessa cry in her car on the way home from the hospital the day her mother mentioned it, quietly, as though it were nothing. It had not been nothing. She pulled out her phone. Not to call anyone, just to have something in her hand for a moment, the way people sometimes need to hold something solid when they're standing at the edge of a decision. The phone was locked. The screen showed the time, 9:47 p.m. She put it back in her apron pocket. There were 14 minutes before dessert service. She had a table that needed wine, a question to ask the kitchen about the allergy at seat 9, and 11 guests who were, for the most part, simply people at a dinner who had asked for a good meal and were going to get one. She pushed back through the door into the private dining room. The room received her without ceremony, which was how she preferred it. She moved to the credenza, checked her notes, lifted the burgundy, and began to make her rounds. The candlelight moved as guests shifted in their seats. Someone was telling a story about a hiking trip in Banff. Rafferty Kane was listening with the expression of a man who was already deciding how to top it. At the far end of the table, Gerald Whitfield caught her eye for just a moment as she passed. She did not stop, but she did not look away either. The next morning, on her day off, Tessa sat at her kitchen table in her apartment in Rosemont, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and the Conservatoire's website open on her laptop. She had looked up the outreach program. It had 14 students currently enrolled, 7 volunteers, and a photo on the landing page of a girl, perhaps 11 or 12, sitting at an upright piano with the particular quality of concentration that Tessa recognized in her own body, the way you recognize the weight of something you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing it. She read the program description twice. Then she opened her email and typed, "My name is Tessa Bowen. I believe you may be expecting to hear from me." She stared at that sentence for a long time, then she pressed send. Outside her apartment window, a streetcar was moving slowly down the hill toward the park, and the morning light was doing that thing it does in Montreal in late September, pale and a little thin, the kind of light that doesn't promise warmth but delivers a clarity that is, in its own way, enough. Tessa wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and watched the streetcar until it disappeared, and in the particular quiet of that moment, the coffee cooling, the city moving, the sent email already on its way somewhere, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something that sat beneath both of those things and was more durable than either. Something that felt, for the first time in several years, like beginning.